As I said, Victor's paper is much more about pure philosophy, and he will be sharing his opinions on the topic of judges and exceptions and how they use that to defeat legal norms. Victor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning. First of all, I would like to thank the organization of this conference and the Belgrade University for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to start discussing with all of you. And also Nicola for preparing in such short-term response. Well, in this paper, I'm trying to present two ways of analyzing how judges create exceptions to rules. Each of these proposals are based on different theories of understanding how judges apply rules, and also they have different points of interest in clarifying in the legal application. For this presentation, I will perform the following steps. I will start by distinguishing normal and abnormal cases in order to differentiate situations in which judges qualify cases that should introduce an exception, or to be more precise, that they could introduce an exception. After that, I will present two types of alternative analysis on how to create an exception that have been offered by the studies of the feasibility norms. First of all, a proposal that established that an exception is the result of a conflict between two norms, and the second of them, an exception is created as a result of a conflict between the norm and its justification. I must clarify that my analysis will solely focus on conditional prescriptive norms understood by the bridge conception. Normal and abnormal cases. In which sense? What are we talking about? Usually, when we understand the composition of a rule by the structure if P then Q, we are not stating or we are not saying that P is a sufficient condition of Q. But we are saying that P normally then Q. This means we have two types of cases. Normal cases, which are in which it's not a problem to assume that P verification leads to Q, and abnormal cases in which the verification of Q does not guarantee Q. The thing is, normality is quite an ambiguous word. It has several different meanings. I will assume that law works as a deductive normative system, so I will use normality as in a normative sense, as a complex notion. Normality involves two types of different considerations, a systematic normality and evaluative normality. For systematic normality, I refer to all those cases in which applying a rule does not contradict any other applicable rule to the same case. This is an analysis considering only the relationship of the norm with other applicable norms. In this sense, normality refers to all those cases in which the normative system offers an univocal answer. In a more precise manner, cases of systematic consistency. The evaluative normality refers to the cases in which the prescription contained in the norm is also covered by the justification of the same norm. The normative abnormality, by the other hand, relates to the scenarios in which, if the norm were applied, it will generate unacceptable consequences. Unacceptable in two senses. First, caused by identifying a normative inconsistency or systematic abnormality, or by the lack of the justification of the prescription contained in the norm applied to the case. This is evaluative abnormality. In this sense, systematic abnormality refers that normative system prescribes the application of norms that are incompatible with each other. The judge, in order to recover normality, this is consistency, must prefer one rule over the other. This implies the creation of a criteria of preference, which implies the non-application of an applicable rule. In other words, to defeat or exempt an application of a rule. Evaluative abnormality, by the other hand, established that there is an acceptable consequence if the prescription contained in a norm is outside the scope of the justification of the same norm. If the judge considers that the reasons justifying the rule are normatively relevant, we assume this, then the judge is capable or is apt to not applying the rule or modifying the rule, as I will establish later, by considering we should apply instead the justification. So we accept the prescriptive level, but I will get to this point. As we can see, when a judge identifies an abnormal case, he is in the condition to create an exception to a rule. If he decides to create one, we should ask ourselves, how can we describe this operation? Or what are we exactly doing when we do this? Depending on how we reconstruct the law, we can have two options, I have said. Abnormality as conflict between rules. The systematic abnormality or inconsistency, the way I'm using it, refers to cases in which judges have identified an inconsistency in the normative system of applicable norms. I will precise it on this point. By inconsistency, I mean the logical impossibility of compliance generated by at least two applicable norms that regulate the same generic case for antecedent, but with different incompatible normative consequences. Now, applicability of a rule, and here I'm following Professor Moreso Navarro's proposal, is an ambiguous expression. We should distinguish between internal applicability and external applicability. Internal applicability refers that a particular case is an instantiation or a simplification of a generic case contained in the antecedent of the norm. In a more simple presentation, refers to the scope of the norm. External applicability, by the other hand, refers to the duty of a judge to use an internal applicable norm in the justification of the ruling. In other words, it refers to the force of the norm. It should be pointed out that the set of applicable rules is not equivalent to the set of rules that belong to the legal system. A judge may have the duty to apply rules that are not part of the legal system. For example, the international private law, or cases when the law prescribes the use of moral rules in its own justification. In these cases, nor foreign law nor moral rules are legal norms that belong to this legal system. The cases I'm interested are cases where the judge has two internal and external applicable rules, each of which have different and contradictory normative consequences. In these cases, we must resolve the case by determining which of these two rules the judge must apply to the case. In order to do this, judges create preferential relationship between the two rules. A preferential relationship between rules is the way we can solve conflicts between them, faced with two rules applicable to the same case and without having to derogate the norm. Preference of relationships can be presented in two ways: unconditional preferences or as conditional preference. An unconditional preference relationship is a norm created by the judge or identified by the judge in the legal system that orders the judges to apply one rule over the other in every case of conflict. A common example are the cases in which legal system established that we should always prefer the application of lex superior criteria versus lex posterior criteria in order to maintain the constitutional supremacy in all the system. A conditional or also this is the case of certain constitutional doctrine of the absolute content of rights. On the other hand, we can create a conditional preference relationship in the cases when a norm established that we must apply one rule over the other in certain cases where both of them conflict. But the preference could change or be reversed in the situations that in other factual situations. This is the common case of a conflict between two rights. In certain circumstances, we prefer one, and in certain other, we prefer the other one. By creating a preference criteria, we are not modifying the scope of the norms. The result is the loss of the force of the norm, which I mean is the duty of the judge using this norm in its justification. When judges defeat a rule, or in other words, when they create an exception in this sense, in systematic abnormality, what they do is to introduce a preference, unconditional or conditional, between two conflicting rules. In this sense, any judge can create an exception, and by doing so, they are only affecting external applicability. They are not changing the legal system. They are only changing the consequence for the legal case. This is one way, very formal, to see the problem. The other way is the abnormality as a conflict between the prescription and the justification. By this way of understanding the law, we consider the justification of rules as normatively relevant in order to determine their applicability. Judges create exception each time the prescription contained in the rule regulates or is applicable to cases that cannot be justified by the justification of the norm. For this point, I will use the theoretical framework of Friedrich Schauer to explain it. Some legal scholars think that a norm is composed by two levels. The prescriptive level, which is a generalization, or to be more precise, the identification of the condition of applicability of that are derived or that have been justified in some reason. And of course, the justifying reasons, which are all the purposes or the reasons that are underlying the norm. In the following, I will call these underlying reasons. Well, we have identified and we say that these both levels are normatively relevant. There can be cases where the antecedent, this is the prescriptive level, is inadequate or doesn't accomplish what the justification level prescribes. These are what Schauer calls recalcitrant experiences, or cases in which we have reason based on the purpose of the norm to change the verdict that we will obtain by applying the prescriptive level. These cases can be over-inclusive and under-inclusive. I'm only interested for this presentation on the over-inclusive situations. These are cases which the action that is analyzed subsumes in the prescriptive level, but but it's not subsumed by the justification level. In these cases, from the point of view of the justification level, the prescriptive level should have include more properties or more elements in the antecedent to exclude certain type of cases from the consequence. A case of over-inclusive recalcitrant experience only, this is the point, only brings us the question how we should solve the conflict between prescriptive and justifying level. One possibility is to assume the suboptimal result, this unjust result in a sense. That is, to apply the prescriptive level and suffer all an unjustified consequence. Or incorrect sense, if we may. The other option is to create an exception, to defeat the prescriptive level. The difference between this approach and the previous one, in the previous one, I have created a hierarchy between norms, while in this approach, I'm applying the justification over the prescription. It means we have to reconsider how we have identified the antecedent of the norm. To be more precise, we have to reconsider the content of the antecedent of the norm in the sense that we must include a new property in order to exclude some cases of the scope of the rule. As we can see, this is not a problem of external applicability, but of internal applicability. We are changing the norm. The creation of exceptions in this sense depends on the way in which the decision-making progress are being carried out. In other words, it depends on what we are willing to sacrifice. Law applicators can choose one of these models, a formalist model, based on that the applicator can only consider what the antecedent has determined, and we should only apply the norm as it is being identified, applying whatever method of identification of norms. And the other is the adaptability model, based that the applicator should consider also relevant the justification of the norm. But by doing this, we are always, in a sense, applying the justification of the norm, because I will apply the prescription all the times it is coherent, in a wide sense, with the justification level, and I'm not going to apply the prescription when it doesn't subsume in this way, and in these cases, I will have to reconsider the identification. To conclude, I have outlined two possible ways of reconstructing how judges create exceptions. Both are alternative to each other, and we will have to choose one or the other depending on what we are interested in clarifying and what is our perspective about the law. And under the first proposal, to accept a law is the result of creating a hierarchy between norms. We explain an exception by the loss of external applicability as a loss of force. This means that norms contain its composition, and we just consider it as a certain case to be accepted. And by the other hand, under the second form, accept is a result of modifying the content of the rule. I'm adopting by the second way, first, a model of decision progress, and I'm considering relevant the justification of the norms. Both of them clearly have conceptual problems, but I think these both ways describe how judges present their way of creating exceptions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Nicola, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Firstly, I'd like to congratulate my dear colleague on this great paper. I think that the theme he deals with in his work fits greatly. with everything we've heard these 2 days. I'll try not to be repetitive. I'll try just to jump to my comments and my impressions of his work. Firstly, I like to say that his work gave me some really great informations about the concept of abnormality of norms, which is actually quite important when you think about it. And I'll try to deal with the first variant of the abnormality, and that's the actual inconsistency between norms. So I agree that we have to build a preferential relationship, and actually where I'd like to get something more precise is who decides that preferential relationship. So it should be either the legislator or the judge.
Okay.
But if it's the judge, where's actually the boundary between interpretation and his decision making? Is the judge just interpreting some norms that are more general, or is he really making the law? Is he really making new norms? When we talk about the second case of abnormality, and that is actually the contrast between prescription and its justification, I wish Jose Victor actually dealt with under-reclusive case, because I think it's really interesting one. But I actually agree with him in almost everything. I just wanted another, let's say, specification. So we have basically two options when we deal with over-inclusive norms. So we can choose the suboptimal way, or we can make an exception based on justification. But my actually question is, should we define some kind of ways that judges should be restricted in that sense, as it seems to me that it can give a lot of room for judges to be not creative, but really not to respect the law, actually to create the law when they should not. And that's pretty much everything I had to say. Thank you so much for this great work.
No, thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Nicola. Victor, you can respond in the comments if you want.
Thank you very much for your comments. Well, first of all, how can we identify a preference criteria and who creates them? We have we have two types of answers for this. First, I will consider a cognitive interpretation model. We can identify the hierarchies by analyzing the legal system. A classic example is legal system usually contains preference criteria based on lex posterior. This is, in this sense, wide sense, the legislator has created them. And there are cases where we have a gap, and those are cases where the judges create the exception. The other way of answering your question is by a skeptical interpretation point of view, which I assume that the meaning are attributed by judges. So in all cases, we are the one that is creating the hierarchy is the judges, but in the sense that he's choosing one certain type of legal interpretation method. For example, the phrase the legislator has created the hierarchy that I just said, it will translate that the judge has chosen the literal interpretation methodology that when he said the lex posterior, it means literally lex posterior.
Yes.
So this is for first. The second point, judges should be restrained. The thing is, and first I will answer it. I will face the question. To be honest, this is a descriptive and analytical paper. So the should and must and questions, I am not concerned, and these are legal ideology. These are problems of legal preference. And I think every hierarchy between legal preference is an ideological preference by itself. So in this sense, It depends on if we like judicial activism in some sense, see, or if we like our judges to be really, really constrained. What I personally think, I think I will answer it why in the same sense. I think this question, and I will introduce it to the paper because it's a nice point, is connected by the idea of competence. In which sense? If I am a high court, I will create a preference between two norms, and if we are based in a system that contains legal precedent system, stare decisis rule, then I will have to follow, in this sense, I will have to follow the precedent from the higher court. But if I am a low court, I mean, first judge that we face, and there is nobody below me, I only say that I should not change my hierarchy by reasons of consistency. I cannot contradict myself. So when should a judge? When should a judge not? Or how can I restrain a judge? By stare decisis rules and by following my own person. I hope I have answered your question. Okay. Thank you very much.
All right, I'll now open the floor to your questions. Mayor.
All right.
You'd be surprised to hear that I have a lot of questions, but
No,
I limit myself to really 2.5.
All right.
I'll start with the half question. You speak about, and I didn't mention that, but in circumventing, for me, extremely interesting, so to follow extensively. You mentioned that under the first model, the criterion upon which you rely in the creation, excuse me, of exceptions is the logical incompatibility of compliance. Now, as you would know, I would have grievance with that, and more specifically, let's take the example of I am demanded by a norm to do something which contradicts my religion.
Okay.
Does that apply as logical incompatibility? Or rather, how do you circumscribe that notion? That's essentially the first half. The second question is concerning preferential norms, which I find like really interesting and complex. So it's just the way you think we should approach that. My question is, what happens in cases of exceptions in the preferential norm itself?
Okay.
Like for instance, you have right. Do you consider such exceptions part of the theory, or and if not, what do you think that we should do? And thirdly and lastly, concerning the second suggestion of the model, how sharp is the distinction? Like how absolute do you see the difference between the levels of the justificatory and prescriptive? And what I mean by that is, and I think you also allude to that when you're explaining your concluding remarks, that oftentimes we'll have over-inclusion, and then we can either accept an unjust consequence or just opt for the exception. And my question to you is, do you have a model in mind for ascertaining the justificatory level of norms? Because it would seem that oftentimes the prescriptive level and the justificatory level would, I don't know if blend, but at least maintain some kind of an interaction. So, your thoughts on that?
Okay.
Much
Of course. Well, how will I present a conflict between having a legal duty and a moral duty in conflict? Well, first, how I will present it, and then I will translate. I will try to explain. I think that when you say that I have a moral duty, it can be translated into a legal duty in the sense of some right protecting my free. I don't know how to say this in precise words. Freedom of religion. I don't know if it's correctly translated when. The thing is, how are my moral preferences protected in the legal system? By some norm that protects me. So the conflict will be between two legal norms. Why, for me, is this important? Because it will, when I formalize this in a logical way, they wouldn't be representing the same thing. They will be representing different things, and because of this, it will be. I cannot conflict between different things. If I say I have a legal duty, then my antecedent will have to be a legal norm, and all that, and the other point will have to be a moral point, and how can I sustain this? By saying that we can apply moral rules and not belonging to the legal system. I think this is the point in the middle. The thing, when the notion of applicability gives you the chance, or gives you the chance, makes available that we can discuss different types of different norms that come from different sources under one's the same systematic level. I make a distinction. I will also introduce, thank you for this, I will introduce it in the paper. We can differentiate a normative system of norms belonging to the legal system and a normative system that contains only applicable norms to a certain case. By this, I can create logical relationships between a new normative system, and this is how I can solve conflict between different norms. Me queda un poquito. Exceptions to the preference criteria. We can have preference criteria conflicting between each other, and we will reproduce the same techniques and so on, so on, so on. According to von Wright, in the logic of preference, we can only have one absolute preference, the undefeatable, unexceptional one. But if we have two absolute preference relationships, it will conduce necessarily to inconsistency. And finally, the problems on the justification model. I think the justification model is just a way of presenting things by itself. It's not very clear and is conceptually wrong, because we can present different facts and reconstructing them by different reasons, and justifying reasons has itself justifying reasons, and so on, so on, so on. So I think it has some clarificatory purposes, but it's conceptually very problematic. Thank you very much for the question.
Anyone else?
It's just interesting that both of you worked on I mean, at least to me, very similar, like problem from very different angles. It's just hard to grasp to some of us since we're not that deep into legal philosophy. But thank you. I really tried to follow you in your reasoning. Thank you.
No, thank you all of you.
I will risk a question.
All right.
No, I mean, it's actually difficult to grasp.
I'm not sure that I'm grasping it completely, but I would, as I understood this preferences over inclusiveness, those matter also in proportionality analysis, and in what some courts do, for instance, in the US, of narrowly tailored norms. So sometimes do judges do something like that? They do not precisely say whether they are going one way, saying that this does not apply, or saying that all these things does not apply, just saying that this norm is not good enough because it's over-inclusive, without elaborating more how this could be solved. So, am I understand? So,
yes,
how does already existing mechanisms of judicial operation as proportionality and narrowly tailored tests relate to your arguments?
Thank you for the question. This is, or what I'm trying to do is different ways of presenting information. I mean, we can also explain the same phenomena with the language of proportionality, for example. If I have to translate the language of proportionality to this kind of language, I will say that proportionality is a way of creating a conditional preference. But I think that the difference between all of these ways are the methodological assumptions that we make and the theoretical framework that we are trying to demonstrate or use to explain certain objects. Of course, we will prefer the one that clarifies, I think, the most. And I think that the language of hierarchies can explain a little bit more about the conflict of principle of norms and also conflict of rights, to be more precise, because it can explain why the result of a balancing is also, first, it means that the principles are not, and this is a tricky idea that I'm trying to work on, the difference between not applying a norm and derogating the norm, which is when we solve a conflict of principles or conflict of rights, the principle that has not been applied is not being expelled from the system. It remains in the system. And I think we can explain this point by making the difference between internal and external applicability. What we have done is that this judge, in this kind of cases, has lost the duty of applying this norm. And this point, I think, is not enough being clear out in the language of proportionality, and it doesn't get, or at least as far as I have read. This is why I decided to present all of this. But yes, they are all in the way. We are all interested in the same things. We are all concerned of knowing what to do in a difficult case. But we should prefer the thing I think one that explains the most. Okay. Thank you very much.
See that
I just ask you, like, for a layman, from a layman perspective, like I go to courts and I see people expect judges to act in a particular way. Like a common man when he reaches the courts and like, you have like in India, the courts sit in different benches and different judges would have different opinions. So there is no commonality to find out what is actually prescriptive and what is prescriptive from one sense of the judge and might not be prescriptive from another point of view of another judge. So my question is that how do you find that out? Like what is a common man perception about law should be? Because law is for the layman mostly, and so when I'm approaching the courts, what view should I have, like a legal realism, so to say? Because like there was this lawyer in India who defined it perfectly. He quoted from Progress Pilgrims where the rower is rowing the boat in one side and taking the boat in the other. So how do you come to a conclusion that this is the real or this is the right way to look at the law and not the way others like to define it?
Well, difficult question, and I will have I know, I'm trying to find the word in English, but it's like a trap. I will say this is an ideological question, and we should know what this law contains under our ideological preference. But I will try to take more serious the question. I will try to go deeper. I think the point is that we know that what the law contains, what the law should contain, by asking ourselves meta-ethical question: are there objective values or not? Is there moral objectivism or not? And in this sense, I follow also a skeptical Mackey's way of seeing morals, and I think we cannot recognize any morals in society because, first, if there are any moral facts, which properties they have, there should be any property, and how we can identify. I think, if there are, all our judgments about what is good or bad are false. We cannot recognize them. So, in this sense, if we have lack of moral objectivity, we can establish the content of certain prescription under preference, and which means, in the bottom of all, we can only follow what is justified or unjustified, and this is it from my point. I'm sorry that you're asking a question about identification of norms, and I have a very short answer. But thank you very much for the question.
anyone else, or we can close the discussion? Yes, okay.
Okay, it's my turn. Okay, I just want to thank you all for coming. It was an amazing experience to just listen to all of your presentations, and I'm really glad that you chose to come to Serbia from all around the world and introduce us to your work. I really enjoyed the discussions. I learned a lot today. I hope that was your experience as well. So I would just like to welcome you to the seminar and our lunch there, where we can just talk more, discuss, and also I would like to repeat, I don't know if everybody heard today, we planned some informal gathering tonight, and we would really love all of you to join us. I will send you an email with all the details, so...
Really?
all the formal details of the informal meeting. So, and also, maybe it would be easier if I all add you on any social media, so we can just be in touch.
Yes.
And that would be it. Have a nice lunch, and thank you all for coming.
No, thank you. We can take a picture.